In the spring of 1984, when I was driving taxis in New York, I found myself one night driving down Columbus Avenue on a very busy night in the rain. Hard driving rain made it tough to see, tough to drive, hard on the nerves. I saw this pink umbrella ahead of me in the rain on the right side of Columbus, and I edged over into the right lane, and I stopped and picked them up. It was hard to tell in the downpour, but they seemed to have just tottered out of Cafe Central, which for several years in the 80s was a trendy spot on the west side of Columbus, around 81st or so. Trendy spot for show business types. It was a young couple. A woman was holding the pink umbrella, and a man was hailing me. They were both young. When I stopped for them, they opened the rear door, and they helped this older gentleman into the back seat. He had some difficulty negotiating the step into the car, and I wasn't sure how old he was. He seemed quite elderly. Young man leaned into the cab and shouted at me, "Take good care of this man. He's one of the foremost playwrights in America." I muttered under my breath, "Well, I'm one of the most obscure novelists in America. I'll take care of him, all right." They went dodging back into the club, and I was left with this passenger who, it turned out, was not old. He was just drunk. A fairly familiar situation, but never too welcome. Cab driving was the first job I ever had, and the only job I ever had, where I was sober and I was around so many drunks. I learned some things about people in that side of the job. A, that people aren't nearly as humorous as they think they are when they're drinking. They'll make these uproarious jokes to each other, and if they're all drunk, they'll all find them very funny. I would sit there stony-faced driving, and there was this odd chemical aura that emanated from their breathing system. Didn't smell exactly like booze, but smelled like booze that had somehow been processed by their pores that would wash up into the front seat over me, and I would know they'd downed quite a few. Well, this guy didn't smell bad in the back seat, but he looked hopeless. He slumped back in his seat, and he took off his glasses. His eyes slid shut, and he was out. So I thought anyway. I watched him and thought about my doom, various possible downsides to this ride. A, he seemed to be in the process of passing out, which wasn't good because I would have to strong arm him out of the car. He looked like a fairly large guy compared to me. That was never fun. And B, if they had given me the wrong address, which often happened, I would have some difficulty, I didn't doubt, in sparking some life out of him so I could get him to give me the right address. If I needed directions, it was very hard to get directions from a person who had passed out in the back seat. I'd had that happen also. And the other downside to it, the really downside, was if he had had too much to drink and was not a polished drinker, but an amateur, and would throw up all over my back seat, which I hadn't had happen yet. But I'd heard about it, and it sounded atrocious. You'd have to get him out of there without getting the sick all over yourself, if possible. You'd try to get paid, but mostly you would just want to get rid of the guy. You'd have to take the car in to the garage, take out the back seat, and hose it all down, and lose an hour of work. A nasty proposition. I'd heard all sorts of variations on the puking in the back seat problem, and I didn't want to have to deal with it that rainy night, if possible. Anyway, his eyes were shut. His head had rocked back in the back of the seat, and I was steering us downstream through the heavy downpour on Columbus Avenue with the wipers going back and forth, metronomically back and forth, sloshing water back and forth. And I was peering ahead, trying to see where the street was, where the lanes were, where the worst potholes were, and eventually came to the light at 57th Street. They were all synchronized lights until that one, and we had to stop in the herd of cars going downtown. Felt sorry for myself, was waiting for the light to change, was looking around at the blurry world and the patterns of the lights on the wet pavement, long streamy patterns, trying to get some aesthetic satisfaction out of a poor situation and not succeeding very well. When I hear this voice come from the back seat, and he says, "So, tell me about some of these novels of yours." I said, "You heard me." He said, "I hear everyone. I hear everything. It's a curse, but I can't help it." I said, "I know exactly what you mean. I'm a prime eavesdropper myself. There's nothing to be done. People like us, we just have to listen and take it in and do what we can with it." He said, "Yeah, that's right." And I said, "I'll tell you about my railroad novel, if you'll tell me this. Was that John Malkovich who put you in the taxi back there? And his wife, Glenn Headley?" "How'd you know?" I said, "Well, I was thinking about who one of the most prominent playwrights in America might be and who would be out with him. And the guy looked a little familiar to me, but she looked more familiar because I saw A Bomb in Gilead last week, preview, down, where is it? Sheridan Square? What's that theater called? Circle Rep, he said. I lauded him for his play. I said, "So you must be Lanford Wilson." He said, "That's right. Now we know where we stand." "And your name?" I told him my name, and then I proceeded to tell him about my railroad novel, Midnight and Sometimes Later, which it was that night, was after midnight. He said, "You know, it sounds very interesting to me. You think I could have a look at it?" I said, "What, you mean at the manuscript?" He said, "Sure. I can't promise I'd be any help to you. I'm a playwright. I don't have links in the publishing industry, really, except for the people who publish my plays, but I'd like to have a look at it and see." I said, "Sure. What's your," well, they told me your address. I got it written down here on my trip sheet. "So if I just send it to this address on West 12th, you'll get it?" He said, "Of course I will. Put your phone number in with it and I'll call you back and we'll talk it over then." So I left him at his address on West 12th Street. He paid me, tipped me nicely, and we each went on our separate ways. He had not puked in the back seat. He hadn't passed out. He had engaged me in the most pleasurable conversation I'd had in a number of days, mainly because he had shown some interest in me. And you get to feeling kind of isolated in New York when you're a drifting cab driver and just one more aspiring this or that in the great population of aspirers. When I would go into my taxi fleet office, 4 in the afternoon, to sit around in the process we called shape up in the waiting room, dismal room with a door that was broken into the bathroom so that you could smell the urine from the toilet out in the waiting room. You'd wait to get a cab and you'd talk with these other characters who were waiting for their cabs. Half of them, it seemed like, were aspiring writers. About another quarter of them were aspiring actors, painters, Olympic athletes, you name it. We were all waiting for our big audition, our big publisher who'd finally come through, big editor. We were all waiting, treading water, driving taxis. So Lanford Wilson was waiting to read my manuscript. I didn't fool myself that this was going to be my big break, but it was better than no conversation whatsoever. I got together my best looking copy of this railroad book I'd written and got it in the mail to him and thought, well, things go well, maybe I'll hear from him in a few weeks, have a conversation. I didn't go back and see Bomb in Gilead. And John Malkovich had directed it. Glenn Headley, his wife, had been in it. She'd been very good in it. But I was interested in this guy, Lanford Wilson, now. And when I'd get people in the taxi, I'd have a guy in the back. I'd say, well, I had Lanford Wilson in the cab the other day. If it was a young gay guy from the West Village, or from Chelsea, or from the meat market area, which is where Lanford Wilson lived, he'd say, yeah, I've seen Lanford Wilson around. We call him Lance. To which I would respond enthusiastically, well, we were talking about his play that's running down the village, and he asked what I did, and I told him about a novel I had written about the railroad, and he was very interested in it, and he said he'd like to take a look at it. To which the gay guy in back would respond, almost regardless which gay guy it might happen to be, sweetie, he doesn't want to look at your manuscript. He wants to look at you. He wants to get into your pants. And I'll go on with you. You're just joking here now. He was a perfectly nice man. He didn't seem forward in the slightest, just friendly. I came to wonder if they were on the level, these guys who said he wanted to get into my knickers and all that, or if that was just bouncy repartee on their part. And they were trying to tease me. I couldn't be sure. And yet they put a little tension into this whole thing, which sort of made it interesting. The weeks went by, but I didn't hear anything. Not a phone call and not a note. He could have written to me, too. My address was in the manuscript. But that was all right. I'd had editors who'd hung on to manuscripts of mine for years sometimes. I didn't love it, but you had to learn to live with it. Spring gave way to summer, and the summer gave way to fall, and still I hadn't heard anything. When the fall turned into winter, I thought, I should try to contact him somehow. I called on the landline to information, which is what we did in those days. The operator said, Lanford Wilson, let me see, here in Manhattan. Yeah, he's listed here in our list, but it's an unlisted number. He doesn't want it given out, so I can't give it to you. Oh, that's too bad, I said. But I had this dim recollection that he had mentioned that he also went to Sag Harbor sometimes out on the island. I said, could you check in Sag Harbor out on Long Island, see if there's a listing for him there? And the man did. Came back and said, yes, there is a number listed there. I can give you that number. I wrote it down. I called the number. Man answered the phone. I said, is this Lanford Wilson? He said, yes, it is. I said, well, this is Richard Mosier. I had you in my taxi one time almost a year ago back. Richard, yes, I've got your novel right here on my desk. I was just about to read it. I've had to travel to Europe. I've had to go here and there, and I haven't had a moment. Been intending to read your manuscript, but I haven't gotten to it yet. I'll tell you what, I'm going out to California next month. And while I'm out there, I'm going to be sitting around this swimming pool of these fools who want to fly me out there and fly me back. And I won't have that much to do out there. I'll have plenty of free time, and I'll read your story there. And then I'll get back to you as soon as I get back in a month or two. How's that sound? I said, that sounds marvelous. I look forward to hearing from you. And we hung up on the best of terms. A month went by, a second month went by, another year went by. It had been a long trip to Hollywood for him if he was going to read it there and call me immediately on his return. But my first mood of optimism fell back into a mood more of tempered stoicism, where I was thinking, I'm not going to look at this as something that's sure to happen so much as a little story of its own. I'll just let it float on away from me out into the ether of New York and Long Island and Hollywood or wherever it floats. And it's up to him to act on this. Either he'll read it or he won't. And that will be the denouement of this story. It'll work itself out one way or another. Easy to say. Another 6 months went by, and I called him again, this time at his Manhattan number, because he'd given me his Manhattan number when I called him in Sag Harbor. So I had both numbers now. They were both listed with me. A couple of years had gone by at least. Phone rang, man answered. I said, "Is this Lanford Wilson?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "This is Richard." And before I'd even said my last name, he said, "Richard, I've got your manuscript right here. It's the one with the blue cover, right?" I said, "That's right." He said, "I've got it right in front of me. I was ill for about 6 months. I was incapacitated." "Oh, dear, I'm sorry to hear about that," I said. And he said, "No, it's not what you think. It's not HIV. I don't have AIDS or anything like that. But I had a back problem. It's better now. And I'm going to get to your novel right away. Then I'll phone you and we'll talk it over. I'm looking forward to it." "Well, so am I," says I. And I was looking forward to it, but in a different way than I had before. I was watching him now as a character. Maybe he's one of the foremost playwrights in the whole world, for all I knew, making up great characters and everything. But in my mind now, he was a character himself in our own little drama, little comedy. He didn't call in a few weeks. They have read the manuscript for all I knew. They have hated it. They have loved it. They have lost it. All the possibilities went through my head, but I didn't act on them anymore. I had acted to my maximum extent. I was going to wait and see what fate delivered in terms of ending to this story. A year went by, and hard rain was beating down on Manhattan again. But this time, that first rainy night when I picked him up, it had been a terribly busy night. I hadn't had 20 seconds without a passenger, it seemed like. Whereas this night, 3 years later, I was invisible to the world. No one seemed to see me. I was the phantom taxi driver in the phantom taxi cab. I would slow up, pull over for someone who's hailing a cab. They would step around the back of my car and get into another taxi and drive off. I was something else than a taxi. I was like a decoy in their lives. Finally, I got dispirited by this. This had happened to me before, a time or two, cab driving. It had happened for 20 years to me in terms of being a writer. I was a phantom aspirant in the eyes of the publishing world. No one saw me. So this was a familiar phenomenon, and yet driving, it hadn't happened more than once or twice, and never for as long as happened that night. That night, I'd been driving this one stretch for 35 or 40 minutes without a fare, without anyone hailing me, needing a ride, even though it was pouring down rain. Their umbrellas were blowing inside out and the wind blowing sideways. It was a mess. So I thought to myself, if my luck is this bad right now, I'm just going to plant my ass someplace and wait for someone to come out and hop in. I was down in the village at that point when I came to that sorry decision. So I pulled up in front of the Lion's Head on Christopher Street. Funny enough, right at Sheridan Square, right where I'd gone to that Balm in Gilead play some months earlier, some years earlier. And I sat. I left the engine on, so my headlights were on still. My wipers were going back and forth, beating their sad rhythm in the night. And the dome light was on with my medallion number lit up, indicating that I was available in my beleaguered state. just sitting there in the parking lane. And this one character came running out of the place, ran right past me, stamped in the rainy gutter a couple of times, and hailed another cab that was moving down Christopher Street, got in and rode away. He hadn't seen me either. A while later, another sorry figure comes stamping out of the Lion's Head, starts to go between the gap between me and the next car parked ahead of me, waves frantically at a taxi going past, but that cab had passengers in it. At this point, I leaned forward, rolled my window down, and said out the window, "Hey, buddy, I'm available." And he spotted me then. He turned and walked around to the passenger side. He climbed in, and he starts to tell me his address. And I said, "Now, aren't you Lanford Wilson?" And he said, "Richard, I read your manuscript last week. It's on my desk at home. Come on back with me. Come up to my apartment and we'll talk it over and have a glass of wine." Just like that. So his apartment was no more than 3 or 4 minutes away. We drove over there in the rain, parked the cab, went up to his apartment. I had no fear he was going to try to seduce me or anything of the sort. He just seemed friendly. And his apartment, I remember, was on the 3rd floor in this building. We got up there, and while he was going over to his desk, and sure enough, there was my manuscript right on the top of the heap of stuff. Nice apartment. Should be. Foremost playwright of this and that. I said, "How come you got these bars on the windows?" He said, "Well, I'm claustrophobic. I'm worried about that. I'm kind of agoraphobic too." I said, "Yeah, I noticed you got bars even on your balcony outside." I said, "Are you nervous about going on the balcony? I mean, this is only the 3rd floor." He said, "I never go on my balcony, but I've had those bars put up there anyway." And they were high. They weren't railing height. They were about 6 feet high, these bars. So even the foremost playwright in the borough of Manhattan would have his nervous moments. Anyway, he wasn't nervous then. He was very ebullient, and so was I. Here, we had a glass of wine each, a nice bottle of wine he opened up. He discussed my manuscript with me, and it was clear he had genuinely liked it. He had read it carefully, given it a close reading. He talked about various characters in the story. He liked the railroad scenes, the late nocturnal haziness of some of it. This play that I'd gone to, Balm in Gilead, had taken place in a downtown diner sort of situation. Very bleak, a lot of loneliness, a lot of low-life characters. So he'd clearly known that side of life even more than I had, since he was gay and I wasn't. He was an outsider in that way as well. This was still the 80s and things were tough, really tough for the gay community. I was learning about the realities for the gay community as I drove my cab. I'd been very naive when I'd come to New York in the early 80s. And gradually, my eyes had opened up to the human tragedy that was all over the place in lower Manhattan. These guys I would drive from bar to bar, sometimes late at night, on their own, lonely. One guy said to me, "Why would I choose this life? I ask you, all these Republicans in Congress, President Reagan, they're all saying, oh, this was a lifestyle choice. I'm getting what I deserve by this worrying about this disease that may kill me. Why would I choose to be this way? You got to be kidding me." "It's lonesome," he said. And I believed him. And more than one guy opened up and said that sort of thing to me in the solitude of my car, jostling around the darkness of late night Manhattan. I was kind of like a bartender in that sense, or a hairdresser, the figures in life that people tend to open up to and confide in. They always knew they'd only see me for 5 or 10 minutes and never see me again, except Lanford Wilson. He did see me again. Unlikely as that seems. Phone calls did no good, but chance, coincidence, helped me out. So he said that night during our second glass of wine, I've been trying to think of a way I could help you with this novel. It really should be published, I agree with you. But if I showed it to my agent, it wouldn't do any good because my agent is a dramatic agent and what you need is a literary agent. I could show it to my publisher at Hill and Wang. I'm good friends with Arthur Wang, and I'll talk with him about it. I said, that's terrific. Very kind of you. Nothing kind about it, he said. I'd like to help you out here, and it's important to me. And then we got to talking about other things. Now that we'd gotten literature out of the way, and far from it being a question of any sort of sexual advances like these wags had been promising me was going to happen if I ever ran into Lanford Wilson again, Lance, as they called him. What he wanted to talk about was his boyfriend, who lived up in Westchester County. They'd been going together for 14 years, and he missed the guy, and he was telling me about that. And I was telling him about my bachelor loneliness and my various comedy encounters, a few of them, and we had a few bitter laughs together. I left the manuscript with him to send to this Hill and Wang place, which I had heard of. It was a good, reputable publisher in Manhattan. We shook hands, and I went downstairs, got in my taxi in the rain, and went back to work. My luck had turned by then. I was visible again. I'd had some validation, as people like to say. Someone whose work I admired had admired my work, taken the time to read it, and was going to try to help me in the jungle of publishing. And eventually I did hear from Arthur Wang at Hill and Wang. He was very kind in his note, but he said no. It was another rejection. And no is only no in the world of publishing. There's no such thing as an encouraging rejection. But there was this. I had a new friend named Lanford Wilson, and I had both his phone numbers, although I never called him again. And when he died some years later, was it 2011 or so, it turned out he wasn't much older than I was. He was 12 years older than I. He had only seemed old that first night in the rain when they'd shoveled him into my cab in front of the Café Central. Though he might have had a few drinks too many, the night was wet and windy and treacherous. But he wasn't old and he wasn't predatory in any sense. He was just a friendly guy doing the best he could out in the world, just like I was.